When word first spread that Florida intended to turn loose a small army of snake-hunting predators into its own backyard, the reaction was immediate and merciless. People online mocked the idea. Comedians joked about it on late-night television. Wildlife lovers rolled their eyes and assumed the state had finally run out of good ideas. On paper, it looked like lunacy. Who releases more snakes into a landscape already crawling with them? But underneath the punchlines was a story far stranger, far more desperate, and ultimately far more hopeful than anyone laughing online could have guessed. To understand why Florida made a choice that sounded so absurd, you have to go back to how a peaceful wetland turned into a battlefield in the first place. Picture an unbroken sea of sawgrass stretching toward a horizon smeared with heat haze, dotted with cypress domes, and threaded by slow-moving channels of water, so shallow you could wade through most of it without ever getting your knees wet. This was the Everglades in its healthiest form, a slow-moving river of grass that fed wading birds, deer, bobcats, otters, and thousands of other creatures that had spent countless generations finding their place in an intricate, living machine. Economists have placed the value of everything this ecosystem provides, from flood control to fisheries to tourism, somewhere north of $30 billion a year. It was one of the last truly wild places in the eastern half of the country, a landscape so vast and so tangled that people assumed nothing could ever knock it fully out of balance. That assumption did not survive the arrival of a newcomer nobody invited. Exotic pet ownership had exploded in popularity across the region, and among the animals that reptile collectors coveted most were Burmese pythons, enormous constrictors native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia. They were sold as fascinating, exotic companions, impressive in size and pattern, and completely unsuited to a home once they outgrew their tanks. Over time, a combination of accidental escapes and deliberate releases by overwhelmed owners put a small but steady trickle of these snakes into the wetlands surrounding the southern tip of the state. For a while, almost nobody noticed. A python here, a python there. Nothing that looked like it could threaten a landscape this immense. That quiet trickle became a flood. Burmese pythons found something in the Everglades that they had never enjoyed in their native range: freedom from predators, an abundance of prey, and a climate warm and wet enough to feel like home. With nothing hunting them and everything around them defenseless, their numbers surged. Females can lay close to 100 eggs in a single clutch, and with so much food available and so few threats, survival rates for those hatchlings were staggering. Estimates on the current population vary wildly, but many researchers believe the number sits somewhere between 100,000 and several 100,000 animals scattered across the southern wetlands, a number that is almost impossible to verify because the snakes are so good at disappearing into their surroundings. The impact on native wildlife was catastrophic. Surveys comparing animal sightings before and after the python boom paint a grim picture. Raccoon populations collapsed by well over 90% in some survey areas. Possums saw similarly brutal declines. Bobcat numbers dropped by more than 80%, and marsh rabbits, once one of the most common sights along the wetland edges, nearly vanished from entire regions. Deer sightings fell by more than 90% in some of the hardest-hit zones. These pythons were not picky eaters either. Fully grown adults, some stretching close to 20 feet and weighing well over 200 pounds, have been documented swallowing deer whole, and footage of pythons wrestling alligators for dominance shocked wildlife watchers who assumed alligators still ruled these waters without challenge. What made the crisis so hard to fight was the snakes' near-perfect camouflage. Their mottled skin blends seamlessly into the grass and shadow of the wetlands, making them nearly invisible even to trained searchers standing just a few feet away. Scientists compared the fight to combating an enemy that could not be seen, tracked, or predicted. Every python captured seemed to be replaced by many more hatching somewhere unseen. The ecosystem that supported a $30 billion economy through tourism, recreational fishing, and natural flood protection was quietly being hollowed out from the inside, and for years the public barely noticed because the destruction unfolded silently, one vanished raccoon and one empty burrow at a time. Once officials understood the scale of the crisis, Florida tried nearly everything imaginable to fight back. Public hunting competitions opened the gates to ordinary citizens willing to wade into snake-infested marshes for cash prizes and bragging rights. These annual events drew hundreds of participants from across the country, armed with hooks, bags, and a willingness to get muddy for a good cause. The competitions captured public imagination and generated headlines, with winners walking away with prize money and a burst of local fame. But when the final tallies came in, the numbers told a sobering story. Even the most successful hunts pulled in only a few hundred snakes at most, a rounding error compared to a population that may number in the hundreds of thousands. The state also brought in professional hunters, paying trained trackers to comb the wetlands full-time in search of breeding females, since removing a single reproductive adult could theoretically prevent hundreds of future hatchlings. Some of these hunters became remarkably skilled, developing an intuition for python behavior that let them find snakes other searchers walked right past. Still, professional hunting alone could not keep pace with the snake's reproductive output. When boots on the ground proved insufficient, engineers and biologists turned to technology. Robotic decoys designed to mimic the heat and scent of small prey were built to lure pythons out of hiding. Trained detection dogs learned to sniff out reptile scent trails through dense brush. Drones scanned wetlands from above, searching for the telltale shape of a resting snake. Some of the most creative experiments involved surgically implanting radio transmitters into captured male pythons, then releasing them back into the wild during breeding season in hopes. Infected pythons shed parasite eggs in their waste. Cockroaches and other scavenging insects consumed that waste, picking up the eggs in the process. Frogs and lizards eat those insects and native snakes, hunting the same small prey they always have, unknowingly swallow the parasite along with their meal. Once inside a new host, lungworm larvae burrow through the digestive tract and settle into the lungs, where they mature and multiply. For many native snake species, especially smaller ones without any natural resistance, an infection can be devastating. Affected snakes have been found suffering from pneumonia, open lesions in their lungs, and in extreme cases dozens of adult worms emerging through the mouth. Breathing becomes labored, energy plummets, and infected animals often lose the strength to hunt effectively, sometimes starving even while surrounded by prey. The scale of the spread stunned researchers once they started looking closely. Nearly 20 different native snake species across the state have tested positive for lungworm infection, and the parasite's range now extends across dozens of counties, reaching well beyond the southern wetlands where the pythons first arrived. Unlike the pythons themselves, the lungworm does not need its original host to keep spreading. It has established itself independently within Florida's native snake populations, meaning that even a complete removal of every python in the state would not eliminate it. The damage, once done, had already taken on a life of its own. Losing native snakes carries consequences that ripple far beyond the reptiles themselves. These animals serve as both predator and prey throughout the food web, keeping rodent populations in check while also providing food for hawks, herons, and other predators. When native snake numbers fall, rodent populations can surge unchecked, and species that depend on snakes as prey lose a critical food source. Curiously, one native species, the Florida cottonmouth, appears largely resistant to the lungworm, and nobody yet understands why. Some suspect diet, others suspect an inherited immune quirk, but for now it remains one of the only genuinely hopeful mysteries in an otherwise bleak situation. It was against this backdrop of exhausted hunters, failed technology, and a spreading parasite that Florida wildlife officials announced their boldest move yet, releasing hundreds of a native, non-venomous snake species back into the wild specifically to help combat the python problem. The internet reaction was instant and brutal. Memes flooded social media within hours. Talk show hosts turned the announcement into an easy punchline. Commenters asked, with no shortage of sarcasm, whether Florida had simply run out of good decisions to make. Some compared the plan to infamous ecological disasters elsewhere in the world, where introducing one species to control another had backfired spectacularly and made the original problem worse. To most onlookers, it sounded like the punchline to a joke Florida had been telling about itself for years. What almost nobody understood in that moment of viral mockery was that the snake at the center of this plan was not some new experimental import. It was a native species that had once ruled these same forests long before pythons ever arrived, a predator that had nearly disappeared from the landscape entirely, and whose return had been planned by conservationists for years, not weeks. That species is the eastern indigo snake, a long, glossy, iridescent blue-black serpent that once earned a nickname fitting for its size and presence, the emperor of the forest. Adults can stretch close to 9 feet in length, making them among the longest native snakes in North America, and their smooth, almost oil-slick scales catch light in a way that makes them look faintly metallic as they move. A patch of warm, coral-colored scales near the throat gives the species an unmistakable, almost regal appearance. Unlike so many of the snakes people fear, the eastern indigo carries no venom at all, relying instead on raw size, speed, and fearlessness to dominate its territory. It is famously indiscriminate in its diet, willing to eat birds, rodents, frogs, turtle eggs, and other snakes, venomous or not. Indigo snakes appear to carry a natural resistance to rattlesnake venom, which allows them to hunt and consume venomous species that would kill most other predators outright, rather than constricting prey the way pythons do. Indigos typically just pin their meal down and swallow it alive, a hunting style that reflects supreme confidence rather than caution. Researchers who have examined the stomach contents of wild indigos have found astonishing combinations in a single meal, including venomous pit vipers, tortoise hatchlings, and other snake species, all consumed by one extraordinarily bold predator. At its peak, this species ranged across an enormous stretch of the southeastern United States, from the hills of the mid-Atlantic states down through the pine forests of the Deep South and westward into the Gulf states, covering somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 million acres of longleaf pine forest, oak hammock, and sandy upland habitat. But that kingdom did not survive contact with human expansion. Logging, agriculture, and rapid development destroyed the vast majority of the longleaf pine forest the species depended on, and by the later part of the 20th century, an estimated 97% of that original habitat had been lost. The species was formally listed as threatened under federal protection, its range reduced to isolated pockets, primarily within Florida and a handful of counties in neighboring states. Habitat loss alone did not doom the indigo. Collectors captured them for the exotic pet trade, prizing their striking appearance. During organized rattlesnake hunts, participants would pump chemical fumigants into underground burrows to flush out venomous snakes, killing any indigo snakes sheltering in the same burrows as an unintended casualty. During periods of economic hardship, people dug up burrows searching for tortoises to eat and killed any snakes they found in the process. Piece by piece, an animal that had ruled its ecosystem for thousands of years was reduced to a handful of scattered, struggling populations. The indigo's fate turned out to be deeply intertwined with another declining species, the gopher tortoise. Indigo snakes rely heavily on the burrows tortoises dig, using them for shelter, warmth during cold snaps, and safety from predators. And yet, at the point when fewer than 50 known breeding populations of eastern indigo snakes remained anywhere in the world, this animal still possessed one trait that made it uniquely valuable in the fight against an invasive predator nobody else could stop. It was, by nature, a fearless hunter of other snakes, immune to venom, undaunted by size, and perfectly suited to a landscape now overrun with an invader it had never even met before. While the reintroduction plan drew online ridicule, something remarkable was already happening quietly across the wetlands, largely unnoticed by the public still busy making jokes. Researchers tracking a massive male python, fitted with a satellite tracker, for a breeding study expected a routine location update one winter morning. Instead, they found the animal dead in the grass, its head removed and hidden beneath a covering of pine needles. Confused and intrigued, the research team set up trail cameras nearby, and a few days later captured footage that stunned the entire wildlife community. The culprit was not another python, nor an alligator, but a bobcat weighing barely a quarter of what the python had weighed, an animal that had somehow managed to take down a fully grown apex predator many times its size. Wildlife experts called it a first-of-its-kind confirmed event, a native predator successfully killing an adult Burmese python. For years, these pythons had operated with almost total impunity, feared by everything sharing their habitat. Suddenly, the balance of power looked a little less one-sided. Some researchers speculated that unusually cold weather had slowed the python's reflexes just enough to give the bobcat an opening. Others wondered whether native predators were slowly learning, through trial and observation, that these massive newcomers could actually be killed and eaten rather than simply avoided. This was not an isolated event. Across the state, trail cameras and field researchers began documenting more instances of native wildlife striking back. Alligators have been photographed consuming smaller pythons. Camera traps have captured footage of eastern indigo snakes, the very species mocked so relentlessly online, hunting and eating juvenile Burmese pythons. Even the elusive Florida panther, one of the most endangered mammals in North America, has reportedly been documented confronting these invasive snakes. None of these events suggest that native predators have suddenly gained the upper hand across the board, but together they represent something the ecosystem had not shown in nearly 2 decades. The beginnings of resistance. The clearest evidence that Florida's gamble was paying off arrived quietly, without headlines or viral attention, in a stretch of protected longleaf pine forest in the northern part of the state. Trail cameras there captured footage of 2 young eastern indigo snakes, offspring of adults that had been part of the earlier reintroduction effort. Crucially, biologists confirmed that at least one of these hatchlings had never been tagged or handled by researchers, meaning it had been born entirely in the wild, without any human assistance. For a species that had not reproduced successfully in this particular region for nearly half a century, this was nothing short of extraordinary. It marked the difference between a population merely surviving on human support and a population beginning to sustain itself. The momentum continued to build in the following seasons. Field teams documented a strong, healthy male moving confidently through restored scrub habitat, alongside more than a dozen other indigos from earlier release groups still alive and thriving years after their initial reintroduction. One female from an earlier release cohort was found still active and healthy years later, a strong sign that these snakes were not just surviving but genuinely establishing themselves in their restored habitat. Sightings began popping up across multiple counties, suggesting the population was not just holding steady but slowly expanding outward into new territory. None of this recovery would have been possible without years of painstaking habitat restoration running quietly alongside the reintroduction program. Conservation teams worked to restore native longleaf pine vegetation, clear invasive plant species, and rebuild gopher tortoise burrow networks, giving returning indigo snakes the shelter and hunting grounds their ancestors once relied on. This ecosystem alone supports hundreds of animal species and hundreds of plant species, many of them found nowhere else. So restoring it served a purpose far bigger than helping a single predator recover. The success has not stayed confined to Florida either. Neighboring states have launched their own reintroduction efforts, releasing dozens of captive-bred indigos into restored habitat and bringing the regional total of returned snakes into the hundreds. Conservation groups elsewhere are now watching these programs closely, hoping to replicate the same careful, patient formula that turned a mocked announcement into one of the more encouraging wildlife recovery stories in recent memory. Nobody involved in this effort believes that a few hundred reintroduced snakes will single-handedly solve Florida's python crisis. No single species can undo 2 decades of ecological damage on its own, and researchers are careful to frame the indigo's return as one piece of a much larger, more patient strategy rather than a silver bullet. What these predators can do is chip away at the problem from a different angle than hunters and technology ever could, targeting young, vulnerable pythons before they grow large enough to become nearly untouchable, competing for the same resources, and gradually reclaiming territory that had been abandoned to the invaders. There's a certain irony in how this story unfolded. The public cheered on human hunters, chasing bounty prizes through the swamps, while simultaneously mocking a slower, science-driven approach built on trust in the very ecosystem that had been damaged in the first place. Both approaches, in the end, were working toward the same goal from different directions. One focused on direct removal, the other focused on restoring balance from within. What Florida's wildlife scientists ultimately proved is that complex ecological problems rarely respond to simple, single solutions. They require patience, careful observation, and a willingness to rebuild a broken system piece by piece rather than searching for one dramatic fix.